I remember a friend telling me that when she went on a flight from Chicago to California, she was scared to death of the takeoff and the landings. The regular flight was fine, except maybe for some turbulence. And as she sat there, her husband was trying to reassure her and telling her that it was the safest way to travel, and the statistics were showing thus and so, and were telling her in his way of trying to comfort her, bring her some kind of peace. And she said all I wanted from him was to hold my hand and say it's going to be okay. He was trying in his way to show his love, his concern for her, to comfort her, to bring her down a notch. And it wasn't working with her, not the way it worked with her. It didn't matter what the statistics were. She just wanted to feel a touch of a hand and to be said things are going to be okay. There are many ways of showing love to each other, to other people. And I think some of the key in life is to figure out what works best for each person. And that sometimes takes time. A long time sometimes if people really don't know and don't have a sense of, well, I really feel love when this happens. It's when I meet with couples before they get married and I talk about Gary Chapman's 5 love languages and ask them, how do you feel your partner loves you, or what ways do you feel loved, and what kinds of things? And it varies. And for them to say to each other, this is what works for me, goes a long way, and there's no guessing. And so you're not lonely in a relationship because you know your partner knows what's to be expected. When Jesus comes to the disciples, he tells them, peace be with you, and they're still not quite convinced because it just seems a little strange until he shows them the wounds, that yes, indeed, physically, this is who I am. You know, because of these wounds, that I am Jesus coming back like I promised. And after that, they were reassured and they had rejoiced because now they knew for sure. They weren't convinced by this person coming in claiming to be Jesus, even though he looked like them, like Jesus. So as the disciples are continuing, they're rejoicing. Jesus again tells them that the Spirit is with them and peace is with them. The wounds, in some ways, signify the worst that life can bring. The most terrible things that life can give, and yet Jesus is standing in front of them. It's like the Rocky Balboa movies. He gets beaten to a pulp, and at one point he comes back and he's getting beat, and he has a new life and new energy. He said, "Is that all you got? Is that all you got?" Because he can take more, and he eventually turns it around and wins. And I think this is Jesus saying, "Is this all you got?" Because if it is, we know that peace will reign in the end, that it'll conquer the fear, the death, the woundedness, the hurt, and all the terrible things. And Jesus standing there as living proof of that. We see that, in the disciples, as they continue their journey, they're waiting. They're together in Jerusalem. There's a feast going on, a celebration. People from all over the world, their world, different nations, and as they're sitting there, the Spirit comes upon them, and we know that the Spirit will come as it will. And Jesus doesn't tell them exactly when, but that it will happen. And it does. And they're blessed with the ability to speak in different languages, or to have the people in different languages understand what they're saying, which is amazing. I imagine for the disciples, they never thought in a million years that this would be possible. The Spirit is acting upon the disciples. The Spirit is acting upon the people hearing it, hearing the good news of God, the God's mighty acts and deeds of power. And they know that the power that God gives is not the same kind that Rome was giving. It was a different sort, one that had compassion for the common person. After all, in the reading, we don't see that there were the government agencies or the chief priests or those in high-level positions were the ones hearing it, but the common people were the ones hearing this message for the common good. The Spirit is talking to them in different languages, not forcing them into one language. So the Spirit was acting in those who are very different, but in their differences, the same message of peace and a spiritual indwelling and a spiritual presence that they hadn't known before. And now, even in spite of their differences, they're able to work for each other, for the common good of the people, because that certainly wasn't being addressed by Rome at the time. And so we have on this Pentecost the indwelling of the Spirit. And Jesus has given his Spirit to his disciples many times. God gives us the Spirit when God breathes life into us. And Adam, and in the creation stories, the clay, the lump of clay, and the wind, God blows the wind into the lump of clay, and life happens. And throughout, there's the wind, there's the ruach, the Hebrew word for spirit or wind, and there's pneuma, which is the Greek term for that same thing. It's more encompassing than simply wind or breath. It's just a whole way of being, a different way. I think for this day of Pentecost, we focus more on the Acts than we do actually on the Gospel. It's one of the many times that one of the few times that we actually do this. But it's important. The Acts, not of the Apostle, but the Acts of the Spirit throughout this. And now they are empowered with the peace of the Spirit to continue the work, knowing with the appearance of Jesus and his wounds and his recovery from his wounds that they too will see the worst that life can bring, yet the power of God is greater. The peace of the Lord is what really matters and sustains and conquers all. Amen.